the incredibly cold, synthesized voice echoing violently from the ancient intercom completely paralyzed Caleb and Nora for several agonizing seconds, leaving them standing under the harsh glare of the halogen lights. The heavy, suffocating realization that they were entirely sealed alive inside a massive, subterranean concrete tomb violently crushed any remaining hope of a quick escape or outside rescue. Caleb aggressively gripped his heavy iron crowbar, his knuckles turning completely white from the intense pressure of his grip. He violently threw his entire body weight against the massive steel blast door again, aggressively striking the impenetrable metal with absolutely terrifying force. But the door remained entirely unyielding, mocking his efforts. Nora grabbed his shoulder heavily, violently pulling him back before he completely exhausted his physical strength. "Stop, Caleb, it's useless. He wants you to waste your energy," she whispered frantically, her wide eyes scanning the massive, brightly lit command hub for any alternative escape route. High above them, the massive, deeply rusted security cameras heavily mounted in the corners of the ceiling violently whirred to life with a metallic click. The heavy motorized lenses aggressively rotated, loudly clicking as they mechanically tracked Caleb and Nora's every single movement across the concrete floor, leaving no blind spots. The unseen architect was aggressively watching them in incredibly high definition, studying their rising panic like scientists studying lab rats. Relying purely on his intense survival instincts, Caleb aggressively pointed toward a massive, heavily bolted ventilation grate located high up on the far concrete wall near the ceiling. If this place was built for severe fallout, it absolutely has a heavy manual air intake shaft leading entirely to the upper sub-levels, Caleb stated fiercely, his voice tense. He aggressively dragged a heavy metal desk directly beneath the massive vent, violently using his crowbar to aggressively pry the thick rusted iron bolts completely out of the decaying concrete wall. The massive iron grate fell violently to the floor with an incredibly deafening crash that echoed down the connected tunnels. Caleb aggressively boosted Nora up into the pitch-black, highly claustrophobic shaft, completely ignoring the thick, suffocating layers of ancient dust and highly toxic rust, violently filling their lungs and causing them to choke. He aggressively hoisted himself up immediately after her, violently kicking the heavy metal desk away to deeply confuse anyone trying to follow them into the vent system. The heavy ventilation shaft was incredibly narrow, violently forcing them to crawl aggressively on their hands and knees through absolute pitch-black darkness, the cold metal scraping against their elbows. The air was incredibly stale and deeply freezing, heavily vibrating with the terrifying mechanical hum of the massive facility operating somewhere deep below. Nora crawled aggressively forward, utilizing the incredibly weak, gushing light of her secondary backup flashlight to violently pierce the suffocating darkness directly ahead of her. After exactly 20 agonizing minutes of violently crawling through the pitch-black, highly suffocating metal tube, the heavy shaft aggressively angled sharply downward without warning. They aggressively slid down the steep, rusted incline, losing their grip and violently crashing heavily onto the cold, wet concrete floor of a massively vast, completely dark industrial sector. As they aggressively scrambled fiercely to their feet, rubbing their bruised limbs, the heavy ancient halogen lights above them violently flickered to life, aggressively blinding them with a harsh, surgical white glare. They were standing entirely inside a massive, deeply terrifying water filtration plant that looked like an industrial nightmare. The room was heavily filled with colossal, heavily rusted iron tanks and deep, dark concrete pools of highly stagnant, entirely black water. The incredibly foul, deeply metallic stench of the room was aggressively overpowering, violently assaulting their senses and making them gag. Suddenly, a highly terrifying, incredibly loud mechanical groan violently erupted from the massive iron pipes aggressively lining the walls of the filtration plant. The incredibly heavy, deeply rusted intake valves aggressively began to violently spin completely on their own, driven by automated gears. In a matter of seconds, massive, highly pressurized torrents of incredibly freezing, entirely black water aggressively began violently pouring out of the massive pipes directly onto the concrete floor, creating a raging torrent. The architect was actively trying to aggressively drown them in the sealed room, turning their refuge into a death trap. "The doors! Check the heavy iron doors!" Caleb screamed aggressively over the deafening violent roar of the rushing water. They aggressively sprinted frantically toward the massive steel exit at the far end of the facility, wildly splashing heavily through the rapidly rising, freezing black water. But the heavy handle was completely, hopelessly locked from the outside. The freezing, totally black water was rising incredibly fast, violently swirling aggressively around their knees and fiercely threatening to completely pull them under the currents. The heavy synthesized voice violently crackled through the ancient PA system once again, dripping deeply with pure, unadulterated robotic malice that echoed above the roar of the flood. "Panic is a highly inefficient use of your remaining oxygen. The primary drain valve is heavily located exactly at the absolute bottom of the central filtration pool. You have exactly 3 minutes before the water completely reaches the ceiling." Caleb violently stared at the massive, heavily central concrete pool, exactly where the black water was incredibly deep, entirely opaque and completely terrifying. The water was already reaching their waists, and there was absolutely no way to see what else the unseen stalker had aggressively placed deeply inside the freezing, pitch-black water to violently protect the drain mechanism. Relying entirely on pure, desperate adrenaline and the primal urge to survive, Caleb violently stripped off his heavy jacket and aggressively dove straight into the freezing, totally black pool. The absolute cold violently knocked the air completely out of his lungs, aggressively shocking his entire physical system and threatening to paralyze his muscles. He frantically swam aggressively downward into the pitch-black void, completely blind, heavily feeling his way aggressively along the slimy, heavily algae-covered concrete walls of the deep tank. His lungs burned violently, aggressively screaming for heavy oxygen as he blindly and frantically searched for the massive iron release wheel of the drain. His desperate, violently trembling hands finally struck the heavy cold metal of the massive valve at the very bottom. But as he aggressively gripped the heavy iron wheel to violently turn it, something entirely unexpected and deeply terrifying heavily brushed aggressively against his leg in the freezing dark water. It was entirely solid, incredibly heavy, and completely covered in thick, highly saturated clothing that drifted in the current. Caleb violently realized with pure, unadulterated horror that he was entirely not alone inside the dark, freezing pool. He was aggressively swimming directly next to a highly bloated, heavily decayed human corpse, violently chained securely to the bottom of the tank, a previous victim of the architect's games. Overcome with pure, violent panic, he aggressively twisted the heavy iron drain valve with all of his remaining strength, completely ignoring the horrific floating body that bumped against his chest. The massive valve violently gave way with a heavy, deeply mechanical clunk, opening the floodgates. The freezing black water aggressively began to violently suck heavily down the massive drain, creating a powerful vortex. Caleb aggressively burst violently to the surface, violently gasping frantically for heavy air, But before he could fiercely celebrate their survival, the massive steel exit door violently exploded aggressively inward, completely blown off its heavy hinges.